qbits of own device lines assign course settings and convert the system of this setting. Process at position lines of platforms. Liquidize line courses, data assets lines to your commodities of information sending and travel. How we coordinate that is longitude and latitude streamings and direct lines of grounds, online sequence on communications. So it's kind of like everything you're calculating modifying lines of anything location if it's English is just in conversion. That's all it is in tractions, guys. You just have to understand how to see through its cells, atoms, anything in travel. Because try to imagine how it comes in information sending to its system all through set traction. Okay, so let's change the English lines and set lines of communication. Okay, English. Okay, capitalism, location at capita. All right, so first we start off in exactly what is a line position of 4 lines of flux. That's 4 indicate positions of 5 lines of 6 location lines of sequence. Okay, so I'm just showing you how you liquidize these things. Deposits over grounds, deposits over center, and deposits over flux is that communication, right? And lines, signals, and location lines of grounds. Unsigned location setting a contract location to the cycle. Converts the system all through its networks. Ground sends line condition sending to its grounds. Levels up in 3 centers of travel. Direct lines to intelligence, information sending to systematic line course centers. Into its home beacon and rotation lines of grounds and set lines of communications that travels its point lines graph of flux capacitor. So it automatically changes it in location to its setting. Pyramid activation on over screens, adaptations of flux, location embedded over lines of sequence. Okay, very powerful set position. And this is all done through English. Just English itself. Look at the schematics on that lines. Instant travel. That's a lot of travel recognition settings through ENGLISH. All you're doing is you're decentralizing the system of its word phrase. Let's get in box frame. Let's get into quotons, quotrons. Now, quotron, okay, is lines of communication of quote. You're quoting what you're going to make. Okay, that's online charts and frequency lines of grounds and human resident locations. Okay, now protron is a provision. Okay, you see it in lines of technologies and set calculations, green locations. Okay, so it's all done through imagination. We know that through its equation system, but you have to understand how to use it through a scanner, how to crystallize, decentralize the system with data assets and the liquidity, process your set location to your qualities, into your volumes of your mass, that process your system location, how you see it, and it's investing of your system through consuming line set locations to your products, your byproducts, you're engaging, you're viewing, you're customizing your system. It's really understand how to see your own financial, your own finance, how you see your fiat location setting, your checks and balances, and that position to its savings that puts you in position lines of calculations, green locations, and to digitalize the set location to its system all through calculation your keys. Key is the frame line, okay, to its knowledge existing of you, into kilo mic, existing informations of you, and process that correlates in sending the travels, gets in communication system interactions, okay, knowing the existing of you. So it's on quote and it's in provision all through track communication, all right? So the more you indicate that, the more you understand it through structure of commodities. Now, commodities is extremely important to your system. You just have to understand how to see yourself through a consumer, product, byproduct. Okay, start with 3 centers, right? Travel points, set lines of tubing, screen lines, adaptation of flux. All right, ground centers over 1, cross lines of 2, cross lines of 6, cross lines of 8 in travel. Okay, and you go line center location system and through calculation. Okay, clocking lines of 0, clocking lines of 1, clocking lines of 2, clocking lines of 3. Right, process indication lines of bending over a center, operation line sequence, course centers of communication of flash drive, and direct lines of grounds. Symbols line course centers, direct lines of 3 centers, process lines of 3 set course centers of communication, and direct lines of grounds, power direction, and time frame location lines of setting. Converts the system in travel, and that converts the system to your setting through customizations to your anchors in travel. Okay, flash drive interference, process indication settings all through queuing, rotation lines, operation line set location setting 144 flux, plateaus, information system all through travel, teleportation vessels. Okay, all right, so that comes into anti-carrying. Distribution centers, communication inline connection, import, export, knowing exactly how to go through data sheets, print sheets, core centers, data imprints, line core centers, convergence system, data box, data line, rotations, outline signals, and ground lines of sequence location of panel. High core centers convert the system all through travel. Okay, inside, outside lines of setting. Operation line sequence, data process lines into commodity, information system, all through energy line, rotation line, core centers of communication. Directing ground centers online sequence on the line, core centers and convert the system, box frames inside travel. Now this is where your data assets go in liquidization setting of travel. Okay, goes into customization settings to its the hydraulics. Now the hydraulics has line core centers into line communication setting to all positions to an elevator. Now the elevator goes up and down and lines of sequence lines of panel. Process that indicates lines, process that indicates the system all through calculation lines of travel. Okay. So I'm trying to get you to understand how this all works in your data sheets here, in position location here, all levels, printing all line core centers of scanning, directing lines, device lines, screen location, and system all through travel. So it's important how to understand how to go through grounds, powers, and atmospheres of teleportation lines to your anti-carrions. And it distributes, imports, and exports your system location, your systems all through mass and volume. The connection setting to its imprint, process lines of box frames into qubits, correlation center and registration, direct lines of roll, direct lines of levels. Now that process line core centers lines in position of 1 qubit. Okay, that's 1 qubit line centers and rotation lines. Data sheet, print sheet, tip sheet. 3 centers of grounds. Now, cross lines 4 centers of signals, location system all through travel. Now, coming into qubits, core calculates lines into core centers in communication setting to convert the system in data sheets, print sheets, and tip sheets and set lines of grounds. Set of operation line centers, core set of communication embedding, and 4 centers of sequence and ground lines of SIC location of travel. Process lines, overline centers, overline screen, or adaptation system data assets. Sets core centers of travel, direct lines of grounds, operation lines of sequence, and platforms of communication. Okay, done my equation. So it's really interesting how this is all set up in travel. Okay. Okay, so customizing your anchors and your ledgers is online position to its umbrella and direction. Okay. Okay, process indicates lines. Now you have high position location, 3 centers of levels. Now there's 3 motherships on standby. Okay, and then you get the XT1000s above the signals and foregrounds of sequence and set lines of calculation. Right. Convert the system, liquidize information lines of grounds, on center, on communication, on settings. Process indication across line angles, goes in line core centers of communication. Directing inside lines, XT1000s integrate their set locations into customization to its hangers that modifies line position of data ports, data lines, data sync, data communication, right? Inside travels, directing inside core centers of communication system and pyramids and direct lines of link of communication, right? Directing online sequence on communication setting, all through travel, all through recognition, okay? So there's so many ways to look at this in line centers, and process indicates the system, how you come in line core center custodians. That communicates the settings. So it's all about the qubits. Okay, so we got line center. Let's get into 2 qubits. Now that correlates as communicates to its convergence, all right? Okay, so we have quantum line register. Okay, into balance, checks, savings, bonds. Let's go with that setting in sequence location of panel. Process basics, core centers and convergence system, process line systematic lines, and balance sheets, data sheets, location, and travel. 3 coordinates, 6 lines, 8 lines of 12 and 24. Okay, process lines indicate in setting, all through bedding and screen adaptation of flux. Okay, now that indicates position lines of QRS, platforms over setting. Okay, and line core sends of 3 centers of travel into quartz. That's 3 quartz lines, 4 lines of state locations in crystalline and travel communications. Converge the system data, center line core centers into protons. Protons line course center to the electrons. Electron serve as a location setting to its pyramid activation line course center as a calculation. Directing on centers on sequence on pi. So it converts the system all through setting of operation. Okay, so that's one pyramid. And you go through rainbow graph screens that liquidize your settings to crystallize course centers into line position to your ledgers and travel, your custodians, right? There's your pyramid, right? So you've got ground lines of sequence, okay, and you got 3 measures of scale, process indications and setting, and that indication line center location, and 4 centers in sequence, set the calculation screen location, flux over lines into travel communications. Okay, XC thousands on standby. So once you see the pyramid, now the pyramid comes in a row graph screen, the high lines of channel of operation. Okay, expanding widths over lines embedding, it deposits in your vaults of communication. So it's very powerful how this is all set up. Okay, through qbits, protons and line connection setting. Okay, to all set locations. All through tractions, off location. Okay, off through graph, off through set position of sequence. Okay? So it's very powerful how you guys get your customization settings, all through your ledgers, all through information system, liquidization setting of travel. Okay? So each one has its timeshare, block share, and that position, and correlations and communications of seconds, minutes, and hours, right? Timeshare, block share. All right. So the XC1000 comes in flights, ground centers, picks up the timeshare, block share, and center operation. Okay, picks it up in mass and volume, center lines of travel. Okay, so as it picks it up, it energizes and picks it up in rotation and travel communications, right? Directing ground centers outline signals, travels out locations, sends it to the moon into a backup file. Correlates communication data assets, liquidize your setting location and crystalline, course to communication with set positions, that customize your set course centers and locations to all levels, that opens all lines in your line position to your system into custodian, directing ground centers, line sequence, lines pi. Very complicated stuff, but this is how you guys receive your funds. All through pixelation, graph line course centers into custodian, into anchors of communication, right? Directing lines of grounds. So it's really interesting how this is automatically picked up through distribution centers. Now that process indicates the setting when you come in dispatch. Dispatch are centers of circulation. Okay, they route the routers, and course centers the earth line. That processes your transit numbers, that processes your set location of your commodities of information system. Now that travels as point lines of graph, triangulation. 3 centers of communications, 4 centers of travel. Okay, line centers into pyramid activation lines of routers. Directing ground centers, lines of calculation. Okay? So that's what goes on every time you guys get your refunds, your deposits, location of vaults, and your trust funds. Very powerful stuff how you go through crop circles of Discord and dispatch. Directing ground centers, line sequence, location setting, travel, and air. Now we enter location setting when processor indicates setting through all levels of air, line course centers of 404. That indicates position of flush lines and direct lines of grounds and set lines of sequence crystallization system. Core retraction. Directing ground centers on set location of systems on set lines of calculation. Okay? Very complicated stuff. But the drawing is amazing how you see information. Okay? All right, core provisions and QR coding. This is QRS, QRF, and QRC. Now that you process that through Ethereums, directing that line course centers to crystallines and position location and measure the scales and communicates to its system through its commodity. It sets line course centers into your consumer, into your product, your byproducts. Okay, and once you get into that, you come in 3 centers of travel, 3 lines of indication setting through advertising. This is how the advertising is set up, location of setting through shield plates, and direct lines of grounds and high lines of sequence through pi. Process indicate lines, flux over lines, triangulation over flux. 3 centers over travel, 4 centers of scale of communication of pyramid activation lines and set lines of sequence. Ground centers, the correlation of communication setting, flight manifest, and lines of travel. Travel breaks and timeline, set lines of sequence. Platitude line rotations, eye coordination, and 3 centers of communication. In directions, and process calculation. Inside line connections and convergence, data formation sheets, print sheets, location and sending calculation. Inside line connection setting and travels. Center ops, center communication and travel communication. All right, direct inside lines. Okay, so we got embedding over 4, 6, 8, and 12. Okay, your data sheets, your imprints, and location setting comes in convergence system with seconds, minutes, and hours in frame. Okay, through your deposits, your vows, and your trust funds and travel. So it's really interesting how you come in that information set and how it's all set up locates to its activity system, all through plateaus of travel. Okay? It's like, okay, what's he talking about? Well, it's very complicated because you have to understand how this all works. And all settings of all central system that set up interactions into EQs and rotation lines of grounds on center on set calculations of window frames. Directing ground settings calculation lines. And I'll go with the pixelation grounds, center op line centers, triangulation over lines, triangulation on line position of 3 lines of flux. Okay. Then we expand the line centers 3/4 of an inch. Each line signal that process indicates setting embedding and over ground lines of set location and travel. Then we correlate longitude and latitude and location system and travel point lines of graph. Crown is recognition of time frame. There's the crown. All right. All right. So the crown is the jewels. Now understand that position, location, your abundance that processes your system that travels its point lines of graph to its set line calculation setting. Okay. Which is the cup of life, your abundance. So you understand what the neck is. Neck is the clustering that you go through the line centers and screen line adaptation, cross lines of mitigation setting. So we'll go to 3,000 line centers under the ground lines of sequence in platitude rotation and travel calculation, line calculation, stargates, and portal of communication. Okay, directing lines on line center on sequence on pi. Triangulation line connection setting, crystal deposits, quartz over lines and scales over core centers and communication position of protons. Electrons, neutrons, core centers, atom line, electron, line communications and fusion. On centers, on communications. Center ops, directing ground centers in sequence. Platforms over E factors, over screen line adaptations, process of mitigations and new travels, and point lines of communication to its graph. Set calculation ground lines of sequence. Operation lines of panels, set core centers of communication setting to its position to its ops system. All through travel. Okay? So that just gives you a basic understanding how it comes into the crown of jewels, into the cup of life. The process indication lines of manifestation, location, your flight manifolds that process your indicate lines of data, assets, location, liquidizations to your liquidities. In that communication setting, now we go through the panel line charge mechanism timeframes that process lines of QRS. Okay, QRS, QRC. Okay, and go position lines of QC. Platforms over lines coming in X lines of 1, quantum Q, platforms over lines, and direct lines of link. So the platforms that equal line core centers liquidize the core centers of qubits, qubits, and set lines of webbing line of rotation. Travel point lines of graph indicates the webbing system and rotation lines of grounds and set lines of travel. Now, in that core centers, structure line to position location. This is where you come to your commodities, into your company's location, your assets, and travel. Directing core centers and line centers, operation line sequence, panel screens, directing location setting defaults over channels, 45 line split lines of anomaly, and rotation line condition setting to your properties and set lines of travel. So it gets very complicated how this is set up location your data. It's operated through your sequence, okay, to your systems. So we go through QR coding, communication coding, CPU coding, and correlation to track core centers of decentralized coding. So it's very complicated stuff, but you catch on very quick about what you're doing in position, location, with cycle, knowing exactly how to customize your custodians, your ledgers, your accolades, your set communication, your companies, your assets, your data formation setting that processes the imprints, location of scanners, into communication to the liquidization system. Crystalline calculation, your corridors. 4 corridors and line core centers, directing lines, line connection setting to your quartz, directing lines and platforms over E factors over embedding over screen. Directing on center, on sequence, on communication system, and travel with endpoint lines of graph and set calculations. Inside positions, operation line sequence, and then webbing lines or rotation lines of set and location. There's your web. Okay, so clocking lines of 12,000 lines, boxing frame, data sheets, data imprints, Data tips and rotation lines, custodians, clocking centers of 0, clocking centers of 1, clocking centers of 3 over travel. Has a direct line link that processes and indicates the system, and flux over screen location appear and activation lines of rotation setting. So that indicates all course centers of flux over lines, directing 3 centers of measure, 4 centers of scale. Embedding over line, defaults, customize, course centers of communication lines and set lines of travel. Operation line sequence and position. All through calculation. Okay? So there you go. That's how it's set up. Okay, through your commodities. So the way I'm showing you this is a true understanding of how you set it up and location your own system, which is all done through your memory bank. But processing that is through its indication setting through its highways, and understand how to monetize this location in your system. Monetization comes in line course centers, and understand how to use that in triangulation and line conditions of box frames. Remember I was telling you about trifactor, how you point lines of graph. Let's get a $sign that sequence, box frame. Okay, so that's 1 cent onto the dollar. Okay, set position 1 coin, 1 convergence, QRS. Okay, that's set up. Okay, now what's that setup location is coin convergence, 4 centers of travel, directing line ground centers and sequence lines of pi. Center operator line centers, here's the ledger and rotation lines of grounds. Customize, custodian, over lines of $cents over lines over pi, directing lines and window frames, track frames, computer line centers and computer coding, directing course centers in position of proton, set course centered electron, neutron, neuron, operation lines of atom, and rotation lines of grounds. Sets course centers, there's the umbrella and set lines of sequence. Operation line sequence, course centers, 3 centers, 4 centers, 5 set course centers and convergence system into process of communication lines of center ops. Directing ground centers on sequence on communications, pair and activation lines, betting over 4, set lines of 6 over lines over 12, and 24 lines of set lines of travel. It's all set up in communication to its umbrella and sequence, and ceilings are rotation lines of ground sequence. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. All right. So I'm just showing you how this is all set up. Your set correlations to liquidization settings, how everything formulates into crystallization. Okay, very powerful stuff. All thing, all location to its operation. All right, so travel is extremely important to the mine line in position location to its anchor point graphs, data process line, direct location setting, custodian location, your hangars, your direct lines, your day bays. A day bay is also operation lines and central line course centers of levels and track communicates to its convergent set lines of travel. All right, that's docile over documentation. Post. QRS, waiting on signal. 3 coins in convergence. Liquidization setting. Core tractions, directing center operation of ledger and flux. Okay. So you have a registration and you have a post registration, which is a ledger. Post is on standby, ledger is in cycle, and levels in balance and set position. Post, ledger, levels on balance. 3 grounds of set lines of sequence, right, across locations. Levels equal lines of quartz, coin line deposit, 1 trust fund, set course centers of convergence, crystallized settings, custodian, customize into URL, FYI, FYMP, IPA, IPO, FAA, process lines and position locations, escape lines of value, process lines deposit, receive funds, and rotation system attraction. Okay, so understand how this all works is understanding the travel matrix of time frame. The process are indicates the system how to convert the system lines of setting. That indicates all levels it travels and how to coordinate and communicate to crystallize the set position of the system, all through betting of operation. Okay? Woo! You have a lot of fun with this position location to its cycle. Okay? The cup of life, the abundance, the manifestation. That's why drawing is extremely important to your mind line, because it apps your systems to its application system to your performance, your efficacies, and location of your settings. E factor over 1. Now, once you get into stocks and bonds, you start to understand more liquidization setting, how it crystallizes air location to its carbon base. Some comes into silicon, which is a 24-line cycle that processes case lines and positions, right? Then you come into lulls, come into crystallizations, then you come into antimantle. Antimantle is the coolant. That's an E-factor line core centers and water containment screen that processes the indication system. Then you come into stamp proceeding, then you come headed state. Headed state is a central set position near holographic city that allocates timelines. Your position locations to your social metric system, your social media system. Core centers calculation your governance settings, process indicates and setting, in convergence. So it's all about using your imagination. And when you understand how to use your imagination, you understand that E equal lines, platforms over lines, indicates settings of travel. Process indicate line core centers, quartz, equals lines over measure, box frame, times share, block share. Equities over performance, bedding over screen. Indicate grounds, on sequence, on position, on the fly. That's foundational levels of U in core centers of IPA. Now, the IPA is initial point, okay, to its angles of communication, its grounds, powers, and its atmospheres and set lines of sync. Okay, so some of these locations to its graph screen locates to its system, all through systematic line centers. It charts over weaving, encoding location system convergence. So inline screens, triangulation over lines over rotation. Process of indicate lines, we change the core centers to calculation line crystallines, embedding over lines into plateaus of custodian, intercept position location and customization system, right? That puts your position to all levels, your current value, into posits, the location setting, and travel communication, right? Your properties. Your properties are extremely important to your system, okay? So it's the infrastructure that you set up, okay, through your commodities of information, okay? Very powerful stuff. So it's just really understand how to formulate and simulate the umbrellas, okay, through an E-course, direct lines of E-flux, process lines of direct lines, position lines of travel. So once you get into central settings, your data ports, the information system, comes in pixelation grounds. Okay, it's overline signals, overlines panels, and center line opposite location of your system. Okay, channels, operation screens, flux over 2, flux over 8, flux over 12, qbits over lines rotation. All right, so you just have to understand how to plateaus your information panels that liquidizes everything to its core. It gets in your seconds, minutes, hours, and travel of direction. Okay? Then you go through the center ops of center line centers, 3 ledgers and rotation of custodians, 4 centers of measure and scale. Okay? Time centers, time calculation, time replacement of scales. Rotation spin cycles, 3 centers of scale. Process indication lines of grounds, operation lines of sequence of clocking zeros, clocking 2 over factors over 3. Sets convergence, time shares, lock shares, location to a system. So clocking centers, operation data sheets, computer lines, core centers into the calculation setting, the neurons. Platforms over E factors, bedding over rotation of ground lines of set calculation of symbolism. Process indicate lines, on centers, on communication of system, all through travel. Okay, so you see your commodities going this way in sequence, your location, your properties. So data formation lines of block, data formation lines of 2, and data formation lines of 1 qubit over screen. Okay, so it's complicated, but like I said, it's a lot of fun when you understand the platforms of communication and what's going on through travel. Okay, so we indicate lines of settings. 12 convergence setting, 12,000 line scale. And that position line is a position. Then we operate the signal, we operate the directions in location setting and calculations. Face recognition. Stamp proceeds, right? There's my face, okay? So nobody can touch my data, my assets, my liquidization setting to my core. That's converted into location to its properties. That's already set the position of its travel, right? So as long as you put your face there, you're good to go, head of state, and set position. Face recognition. Very powerful stuff, guys. So that converts back to you, of custodian of customization settings. The process you're anchoring in that position of setting. That opens all signal location system how to plot it to your location settings of what you have embedded through your treasuries, of its inventories, and set communication system all through travel. Your trust funds. Okay? So, but look how amazing that is. Head of state. Put your set position lines to a dollar bill or a coin. You put your face recognition, your stamp precedes every location to its system all through cycle, all through traction locations. But you always have a face recognition. That stamp precedes everything, embedding. Wow, eh? So that's why I want you guys understand the liquidization setting to use Skynet. Your sky position lines are set with correlated settings. So there's 12,000 lines of divots. That's going to be around the panel. And 24 in operators and meters. Set lines of 4. 3 ground centers, 4 centers of symbolism. Commodities over lines and flights of a navigation settings. Process mitigate line, course centers, directing lines embedding over screen location. Okay, operation line signals. Setting operation of platform, computer operation. Outline center, outline circuit, outline core center, communication of travel. Inside position, inside outlines of travel. Inside, outside line of travel. Box frame, communication of convergence. Directing inside lines. High signals into platforms of E factors over lines of distribution. Set core centers, calculation X8000, 1 centers, process line, indicate picks up line box frame, triangulation line, core centers, convergence lines of travel. Directing inline centers in position, mothership comes in, mass and volume in travel. Sets operation line signals, location setting, convergence set position, triangulation line position, box frame, triangulation frame, time share, block share. Okay, 3 block shares in mothership, rotation, and travel. Okay, very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. Okay, and that position is convergence out through travel communication. All right, but you can see the structure line, very powerful stuff when you go into the convergence setting to its operation sequence. Okay, there you go. All right. So I'm just getting you guys to understand how you have to come in your face recognitions now. It's very important because the actual face recognition is the head of state, and that puts you in position digital key that gets you in encryption, so nobody can touch any of the information setting. Nobody can cross your settings. Nobody can be a position of offline centers. Nobody can line center location and position of confusion because you're directing your set location of your pyramids and rotation lines of path. So you're expanding the pie around the indication system. All through clockings, all through ledger, all through custodian. Okay, and then you apply it to triangulation above the system. Above the system, right? And you go outside the system in triangulation. Set up the bridging, crystallize and set position. Bridge is set up. Okay, center course centers, clocking lines is 0 in projection. Okay, quivel down. Computer bits, nanoseconds, 3 flights of manipulation line centers of travel. Okay, now that comes into neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is Neuralinks. Networks over line, plasma over screen. 3 centers of scale, 4 centers of measure. Okay, so it's very powerful how we recognize these things in platforms of communications. And it's all connected to your commodities and 4 centers of flux. Operation sequence, operation lines of panels. Okay. Now, the higher you go through channel operation screen lines, you go to high pi generation lines of computer operation lines of settings, instant lines of travel, and direct lines of link. Okay, in your webbing system. Okay, every webbing system has a head of state. Okay, that protects your commodities, their information, that protects your properties, that protects your assets. That protects everything you have in your deposits, in your quartz, in your coins, in your treasury, in your vaults. Okay, very powerful stuff once you recognize that position of systems all through setting of operation. Okay, All right. Okay, so drawing sequence lines of panels, you have to process the betting system, how it comes into all core sets of communication and conversion. All right. So it's kind of understanding how to use your CPU and go through digitalized settings of platforms. Go through the E-code lines, how to get in your central setting locations. It's no difference in having a digital frame line core centers that locks the patterns that put you in positions into your proficiencies, your prophecies, and how you use your cartridge. Now, cartridge line center location is direct lines of correlations, lines of colors of patterns that recognize your time frame that process your face recognition time set lines of sequence that put your data deposit location setting that liquidize your settings to your equities that process your sys location to your performance that puts you in position location to your social metric system and your social media system. Okay. All right, so track core centers, compute line centers, operation lines, computer bits, directing ground center 0, 1. Set position of flights over 0, 2. Custodian over lines and clocking 0. And rotation lines of flux. Okay, so qbits over lines, center operation line settings, travel point lines of graph, and set calculation. Merge 144 flux. Set core centers, time centers, set lines of 3 centers of circuit, stamp proceeding, face recognition. Right? Then you work with a clock line outside line scale and rotation lines of grounds. So nothing comes in and nothing goes out in set position because you stamp proceed your face a direction time frame in real time. The process indicates the setting of flux embedding, circulation, and rotation lines of data sheets, process sheets, tip sheets, and location lines of travel. That indicates all core centers of communication of the convergent system, all through operation lines, and circulation or rotation to its atom of rotation lines of screen and direction. Okay, all in setting, all in set position to its calculation. Okay? All right, so drawing is extremely important, especially when you get in that convergence, because you're always getting your vision lines. And you get your data, and you get your imprints, and you get your deposits, your registrations, your regulatories, and that communication setting. Registration path is a process how you come in your platforms of QRS. Now that puts positional levels. You come in a quantum, or proton, or electron, or neutron, or neuron. Okay, that's an atom line 1 cycle, 1 set locations into 25,000 line divots over 1 transit. Now I'm going to equalize settings into lines of 007, general AI, information, logging in. So you bring it in set position, all through operation settings, comes in qbits over lines into hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics, people, face recognition, see the faces? Stamp precedes everything. Data sheets, imprints, all through set position up operation, all right? Information channels of transits over number. The process indicates settings of travel. It's complicated stuff, isn't it? That's why I say complicated, because it's precise and so many levels of perfection. How we center core that communicates the system to our treasuries through our pyramids of activation settings of our trust funds. Pyramid 1, pyramid over 2, pyramid over 3. Center 1, center 2, center 4. Center 6. Center 8, center 12, 24, 48, 62. Okay, so it's just all pyramids working from the grounds up in rainbow graph screens and set lines of travel. Okay, crossing angles, 45 split lines of anomaly. Okay, now these are your datas, these are your imprints, these are your data sheets and your tip sheets into your QRS, QRF, and QF in position platform. That process its location grid of its rainbow. See? Rainbow. Right, so the X2000 comes in. Let's bring in the mothership, right? Because there's a lot of mass volume through custodian that goes into its ledger, that process location setting, that imports and exports its locations all through travel. So it picks it up, all formation lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, set lines of 6 coins in travel. Okay, processing case and centers, indirect lines, inline core centers in position. Picks up and set lines of sequence. Ground centers, line core centers, and convergence system all through operation. Okay? All right. So your data assets has a custodian location settings, convergence system to your data lines, process line, outgoing, incoming mail. That's storage of units, location of setting, data processing. The operation line sequence puts all communication setting in travel. Okay? I know you guys have a lot to say. So once we customize the settings, you go through hard lines of qbits into divots and davits and increments. The higher lines of travels. Start of the ground lines of set position, open lines of space, voids over a screen. Bedding over line centers, rectangular lines, resource. Of course, I have communication position in one ledger. 3 block shares. There's 3 block shares right there. And dimensional line, rotation lines of spin. Okay, X3000 comes in, right? Comes in, position, okay, and takes over traction and direction. Okay, symbolize course centers, 3 convergence lines of grounds on centers on communication on the fly. Okay, FYP, formation lines of 45 angles and travel of communication. Okay, so it picks up the core, deposit the core of the dimensional door. Qbits over lines, directing lines and digital lines of key. Open up the key, set lines of travel. Right? That opens over deposits, flights over lines, FAA, 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 4 centers of travel, IPA, IPO, and ground lines as set core sets of communication position operation lines of sequence. Plateaus, inline centers, in location system, in core of traction. Okay. So it's amazing how this is all picked up. Okay. So once you understand that, then you understand the ledgers, then you understand the custodians, and then you understand how to monetize your system and all through your inventories. Okay, binaries. Let's get an outline 1. Let's get an outline C, backward force. Let's get an outline travels. Let's get a core communication 1 bracket over 1, 0. Set position deposit, equalize, and triangulation. Okay, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of scale. All right, so this just gets more complicated because what you have to truly understand is how to modify your pyramids into your astrolites, astro connections, astro projections, all through the settings of 3 bedding or screen lines, adaptation, and processing, all through indications of your data. Okay. Platforms over key EQ. Okay, and that line screens, adaptations of all zeros, equal lines, correlation, triangulation, all formation setting. Indicates all core centers that communicate. So a triangulation box, formation lines of grounds. Okay, commodities over set lines of travel. Very complicated. Like I said, it's just so confusing, but it's a lot more fun when you understand that set lines of travel of communication. Okay. Bedding over sequence in grounds, lines, and symbolism opens all communication deposits, knowing how to use the information setting to your commodities. That puts all communication settings all through its operation. All right. So I know you guys have a lot of questions, but I'm just trying to get you to understand how this all works, how you have to liquidize your settings, understand the custodian, understand your ledgers, understand your time, understand your foundations, understand your clockings, knowing exactly how to see the information of your checks and balances, your stocks and bonds, all through its information system, all through your properties. Your currency value, your checks, your balances, your savings, your stocks, your bonds, your time shares, your block shares, it all comes together, right? But I'm just showing you how this is all set up in set position of face recognition, okay? Face of recognition, okay? So that's it. We're going to go on that level. So this is going to help you to understand how to customize your own systems and become your own individual settings to your mind imagination system into your own financial fiat system. Okay? We'll be in custodian lines level A, level C. See you in 5.